At midnight, this empire still believed it would last forever. They had the largest fleets on Earth, more gold than any kingdom in history, more slaves than any civilization had ever owned. And yet, at that very moment, the empire was already dying. Not by invasion, not by rebellion, but by something far more dangerous. Truth. This is the story of the empire that ruled the world through chains, coins, and silence. Chapter 1. The empire that fed on human beings. Before it ruled the world, this empire learned how to harvest people. Not land, not gold, not armies. People. Entire villages were erased not by war, but by contracts. Men, women, and children were captured, chained, and sold across oceans as if they were sacks of grain. Their names were stripped away. Their languages were silenced. Their identities replaced by numbers on shipping ledgers. This was not chaos. It was organization. The empire built a system so efficient that human beings became an export commodity. From the coastlines of West Africa, millions were forced onto ships designed not for comfort, but for maximum cargo density. The holds were dark, airless, and packed so tightly that many could not even turn their bodies. Disease spread. Despair spread faster. Some died before the ships even reached the open sea. Others jumped into the ocean, choosing death over bondage. But the empire did not care. Every body that survived the journey became a financial asset. Across the Atlantic, vast plantations were waiting. Fields of sugarcane, cotton, tobacco, and coffee stretched to the horizon. These were not farms. They were labor extraction machines. And they ran on human suffering. Slaves worked from sunrise to collapse. Children were born into chains. Families were separated at auction blocks. Yet none of this appeared in the imperial records. On paper, it was simply production. Sugar sweetened the tea in royal palaces. Cotton clothed the aristocracy. Coffee fueled the cities of Europe. But every product carried a hidden truth. Someone had been broken to make it. The empire's wealth exploded. Banks flourished. Merchants became nobles. Entire cities were rebuilt in stone and gold. And the fuel for this rise was not innovation or genius. It was stolen life. What made this empire different from the tyrannies before it was not its cruelty, but its scale. Never before had an entire global economy been built on forced human labor. Never before had shipping routes, financial markets, insurance systems, and colonial governments all aligned around one brutal idea. Some people were disposable, and so the empire learned a dangerous lesson. As long as the ships kept sailing, as long as the plantations kept producing, as long as the money kept flowing, it could pretend nothing was wrong. The suffering was far away. Across oceans, beyond the horizon, out of sight meant out of conscience. This was the true foundation of the empire. Not law, not faith, not culture, but silence. Silence from those who benefited. Silence from those who feared. Silence enforced by whips, chains, and guns. And for a while, it worked. The world grew richer. The empire grew stronger. And millions disappeared into the machinery of profit. But no system built on dehumanization remains stable forever. Because when you turn people into property, you also turn rebellion into inevitability. And somewhere, in the darkness of the plantations and the depths of the ships, the empire's end was already being written. One broken life at a time. Chapter 2. Gold that came from the earth like a curse. The empire's true power did not come from its kings or its armies, but from what it pulled out of the earth. Deep in the mountains of the New World, In places so remote they barely existed on imperial maps, entire landscapes were torn open in the search for gold and silver. These were not ordinary mines. They were wounds carved into the planet itself. The most infamous of them all, Potosi, rose like a cursed monument in the Andes, a mountain so rich in silver that it was said a bridge of pure metal could be built from it to Europe. But beneath that glittering myth lay a reality soaked in blood. Indigenous civilizations that had lived on these lands for centuries were forced into tunnels that collapsed without warning, filled with poisonous air, and swallowed men whole. Every year, tens of thousands entered those mines and never came out again, their bones becoming part of the mountain's foundation. The empire called this progress. It called it civilization. It called it destiny. In truth, it was extraction on a scale the world had never seen before. Entire economic systems were redesigned around one idea: turning the earth into money. The silver from Potosi, the gold from Mexico, the treasures looted from conquered cities were shipped across oceans in guarded fleets, flowing directly into imperial vaults. This metal did not just enrich the empire, it reshaped the global economy. European banks expanded, new currencies emerged, and international trade exploded, all powered by metal pulled from lands that had been turned into graveyards. But gold carries a strange kind of poison. The more the empire received, the more it needed. Wars grew more expensive, armies grew larger, bureaucracies multiplied. And so the mines had to go deeper. Labor had to be cheaper. Lives had to become more disposable. Indigenous workers died in such numbers that entire regions were depopulated, forcing the empire to import enslaved Africans to replace them. Thus, the curse of the mines and the curse of slavery became one and the same, feeding each other in an endless cycle of destruction. In the imperial capital, this gold appeared as something magical. It funded cathedrals, palaces, and grand avenues. It paid for paintings, philosophers, and scientific breakthroughs. To the ruling elite, it looked like proof that history itself had chosen them. But they never saw the faces of the dead who made it possible. They never heard the coughing of miners choking on mercury fumes or the screams of workers crushed beneath collapsing tunnels. The wealth arrived clean, polished, and silence made it easy to believe in lies. Yet this gold was never truly stable. It distorted the empire's economy, driving inflation, corruption, and reckless spending. It created a class of officials who cared only about extracting more, faster, regardless of the cost. And slowly, invisibly, the curse began to work its way upward. The same metal that had made the empire powerful was now making it fragile, dependent on a system of exploitation that could not sustain itself forever. What the empire believed was its greatest blessing was, in truth, the seed of its eventual collapse, buried deep in the very earth it had plundered. Chapter 3. The Empire That Couldn't Stop Expanding. Once the rivers of gold and silver began to flow, the empire lost the ability to remain still. Expansion was no longer a strategy. It became a dependency. Every new colony created new costs, and every new cost demanded new conquests to pay for it. The empire found itself trapped inside a machine of its own making, where standing still meant bankruptcy and retreat meant collapse. So it marched forward, not always because it wanted to, but because it had to. From the Americas to Africa, from the Caribbean to Asia, imperial banners appeared on coastlines that had never heard its language. Forts were built, ports were seized, and trade routes were monopolized. On maps, the empire looked unstoppable, a web of territories connected by sea lanes and guarded by fleets. But on the ground, the reality was far more fragile. Many of these lands were not truly controlled. They were occupied, governed by small groups of officials and soldiers, surrounded by populations that did not see the empire as a protector, but as a parasite. To maintain this vast reach, the empire needed enormous military forces. Armies had to be paid, fed, and transported across oceans. Ships had to be built, repaired, and armed. Administrators had to be sent to rule distant colonies they barely understood. Every mile of expansion multiplied the cost of survival. And yet, instead of slowing down, the empire sped up, convinced that the next conquest would solve the problems created by the last. This endless outward push created a dangerous illusion of strength. From the capital, the empire appeared to be everywhere at once, projecting power across continents. But in truth, it was stretched thin. Communications took months. Orders arrived too late. Local governors began to act like independent rulers, skimming wealth and ignoring imperial commands. Smuggling and corruption flourished. The empire was growing larger, but its grip was growing weaker. Meanwhile, rival powers watched carefully. They saw how the empire fought wars on multiple fronts, draining its treasury and exhausting its soldiers. They saw how its wealth was locked into fragile shipping routes that could be disrupted by storms, pirates, or enemy fleets. And they saw how the empire had made too many enemies at once. Expansion had created not just territory, but resentment, and resentment is a force no army can permanently suppress. Even within the empire, cracks began to form. Taxes rose to pay for wars. Trade monopolies angered merchants. Ordinary citizens began to feel that the empire's victories abroad were being paid for with their own poverty at home. The promise of endless growth started to sound hollow, yet the leadership could not stop. To admit that expansion had become dangerous would be to admit that the entire imperial system was flawed. And so they kept pushing outward, conquering more, governing more, and spending more, even as the foundations beneath them weakened. The empire had become like a fire that must constantly consume new fuel to avoid burning itself out, unaware that in doing so, it was only accelerating its own destruction. Chapter 4. The Lie That Held It All Together. Every empire needs a story to survive, and this one told itself the most powerful story of all, that it was chosen. Chosen by God, chosen by history, chosen by destiny itself to rule over others. This belief was not just preached in churches or written into royal decrees. It was woven into every institution of power. Kings ruled by divine right. Conquests were framed as sacred missions. Even exploitation was dressed up as salvation. The empire did not claim to steal. It claimed to civilize. It did not admit to enslave. It claimed to convert. And in this way, the greatest crime of the empire was hidden behind the most beautiful words. This lie gave meaning to brutality. Soldiers were told they were spreading light. Officials believed they were bringing order. Merchants convinced themselves they were advancing the world. As long as everyone believed the same story, no one had to look too closely at the suffering that made it all possible. The whip became a tool of discipline. The chain became a symbol of law. And the silence became a kind of faith. But lies that large require constant maintenance. The empire invested enormous effort in controlling what people knew and what they were allowed to say. News from the colonies was filtered. Atrocities were renamed as incidents. Revolts were described as misunderstandings. In the imperial capital, citizens saw maps filled with colored territories and heard speeches about glory, but they never saw the burned villages or the empty eyes of those who survived them. Over time, even the rulers began to believe their own propaganda. They came to think of their empire not as a machine of extraction, but as a force of good. This made it impossible for them to recognize their own mistakes. When colonies resisted, it could only be because they were ungrateful. When economies failed, it could only be because the people were lazy. The system itself was never questioned because the lie had made it sacred. Yet reality has a way of seeping through even the strongest illusions. Missionaries wrote letters home, describing horrors they could not ignore. Soldiers returned broken and disillusioned. Merchants quietly admitted that the system was corrupt and unstable. The truth did not arrive all at once. It came in fragments, whispered in taverns, and hidden in private journals. But once people begin to doubt a story, it starts to unravel. The most dangerous moment for any empire is not when it is attacked from outside, but when it is no longer believed from within. And slowly, the lie that had once held everything together began to crack. The words no longer matched the world people could see. The promise of moral superiority clashed with the reality of endless violence. The empire had told itself it was righteous for so long that it forgot how to be honest, and in doing so, it lost the ability to adapt. What had once unified millions now hollowed them out. The lie did not collapse in a single dramatic moment. It faded, weakened, and grew brittle, until one day it could no longer hold the weight of the empire built upon it. Chapter 5. The night the silence broke. At midnight, the empire still believed it would last forever, but by dawn the illusion had already begun to collapse. The silence that had protected it for centuries was no longer holding. Across its vast territories, voices that had been suppressed for generations began to rise, first as whispers and then as open defiance. The enslaved revolted on plantations. Colonies questioned the authority of a distant king. Even within the imperial capital, people began to notice that the promises of endless prosperity no longer matched the hardship of their daily lives. This was not a single revolution, but a chain reaction. One rebellion inspired another. One declaration of independence weakened the next frontier. The empire, which had once seemed invincible, now found itself fighting fires in every direction at once. Armies were dispatched, but they arrived too late or too tired. Ships were sent, but many never reached their destinations. The machinery of control that had once functioned with terrifying efficiency began to jam. The greatest shock came when the flow of wealth slowed. Gold shipments were intercepted or simply stopped. Plantations were abandoned. Trade routes were disrupted. The financial system that depended on endless extraction suddenly faced scarcity. Banks wavered. Credit collapsed. The empire discovered that it had built its entire future on the assumption that the past could continue forever, and when that assumption failed, everything else followed. What made this collapse so devastating was that it did not feel like defeat at first. It felt like confusion. Orders went unanswered. Governors acted on their own. Soldiers questioned why they were fighting. The center could no longer command the edges, and the edges no longer feared the center. Authority dissolved not in a dramatic explosion, but in a slow, spreading absence. Meanwhile, the people who had once been forced into silence began to tell their stories. They spoke of stolen land, broken families, and lives spent in chains. These stories traveled faster than armies ever could. They crossed borders, inspired resistance, and stripped the empire of its moral authority. Once the world could no longer be convinced that the empire was righteous, it could no longer be easily obeyed. By the time the rulers realized what was happening, it was too late. They could still command soldiers, but they could not command belief. And without belief, power is only a temporary illusion. The empire still had cities, still had flags, still had memories of glory, but the foundation beneath them was gone. In the end, what destroyed the empire was not just rebellion or economic failure. It was the breaking of silence. The moment the truth was allowed to exist in the open, the system built on lies could no longer survive. And so, in that quiet, unstoppable way, the greatest empire of its age faded into history, leaving behind monuments, myths, and the warning that no amount of gold or force can forever contain the human voice. The ruins we admire today were financed by suffering, and the lesson of this empire is not ancient. It is eternal. Because every empire that hides its crimes behind wealth and power is already standing on borrowed time. Subscribe Midnight Empire and stay with us.